So I just filled out my One D&D PlayTest survey, the new PlayTest 6 survey. And I suggest you do the same. I highly recommend you do it because that's the one thing that Wizards of the Coast really promised after the OGL debacle, is that they were going to read those surveys. I'm not going to break down everything I put in my survey for two reasons. One, not that many people have watched my survey videos. And number two, Treant Monk does a much better job than I do breaking everything down. And I'll put a link to his video down below. But I do want to talk about something that's, I think, even more important. Everything we've seen from OneD&D so far is player facing, and everything has increased the power curve of all the 2014 player classes and subclasses. In fact, it has elevated everything from the 2014 Player's Handbook to the level of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything source book. So that's good for game balance reasons, well, as long as they fix the monk. Because that means that all the player characters are going to be about the same power level, and all the subclasses should be consistently powerful and worth taking. But here's what concerns me. If all the player characters are getting an upgrade, what is that going to do to the Dungeon Masters? We already seem to have a shortage of 5th edition Dungeon Masters, so we don't want to make this game harder for Dungeon Masters to run. So here's my wish list of 10 things that I want to see in the new version of D&D. Number 10. Number 10 on the list is challenge rating, because we all know challenge rating doesn't work, and that definitely needs to be changed. The problem is Wizards of the Coast has said they want the new books to be backwards compatible with all the old books. So this obviously creates a discrepancy of how do you fix challenge rating but still make it match previous edition. What's my solution? Monster levels. Give each monster a level equivalent to a player character's level. And you can keep challenge rating for backwards compatibility. So this would give you two ways to calculate an encounter. You'd have a challenge rating that sets a floor to make sure your encounter is not too easy, and then a total monster level to calculate a ceiling to make sure it's not too difficult. So for example, if you're building an encounter for 5 4th level player characters, that's 5 times 4 for a total player character level of 20. Now you have a budget of 20 levels to build your encounter. So you could go to your monster manual and pick out a level 7 monster, 2 level 3 monsters, and a level 6 monster. And now you have 19 levels of monsters versus your 20 levels of players. And that should be a relatively fair encounter. So you basically just add a new system on top of the challenge rating system. That way it's still backwards compatible, but you have a secondary system to help you manage your encounter budgets. Number 9. Don't expect complete backwards compatibility. I think that's a foolish goal. I don't understand why backwards compatibility is so important to Wizards of the Coast. I get it. You don't want to mess with the popularity of 5th edition by completely changing the game. No one buys a new Xbox and expects it to function exactly like their old Xbox. You want improvements in quality. You want the game to run better and faster. So with video games, backwards compatibility just means I want to be able to run my old games on my new console. And that's what Wizards of the Coast should clearly state about the new 2024 edition. This game is going to be a new, fresh version of 5e, 5.5 if you will, but it will allow you to still run all the old adventures. I think the expectation of being able to use the 2014 Player's Handbook and the 2024 Player's Handbook side by side is silly. That's not backwards compatibility in what we as gamers are already used to. We are used to getting something new and fresh when we replace a PlayStation 4 with a PlayStation 5. So don't expect the 2014 Player's Handbook to be compatible with the 2024 Player's Handbook. No, the new Player's Handbook should replace the old one. The goal of backwards compatibility should simply be you could still run all those old adventures. Curse of Strahd, Storm King's Thunder, Tomb of Annihilation. Be able to run those old adventures with the new Player's Handbook and the new Monster Manual. But don't expect the new Player's Handbook and the new Monster Manual to be compatible with the old Player's Handbook and the old Monster Manual. I think that's a silly goal. Number 8. Do a better job of explaining and defining alignment. In my alignment video, I showed this chart, which absolutely helps explain alignment far better than anything Wizards of the Coast has done before. The problem is, these charts are in the Dungeon Master's Guide under how to build an NPC. I don't understand why they don't take these and just put them in the player's handbook. That's where they belong. Take these charts and an explanation of these charts and put them in the player's handbook for all to see, so that the players can use alignment in an effective way. Number 7. This next one is another example of good rules that have been written and in existence since the beginning of the 2014 edition of D&D. However, it's buried in the Dungeon Master's Guide and should be in the player's handbook. Dungeons & Dragons lays out 3 pillars of play: social, exploration, and combat. And we all know that 5th edition is focused on combat. There's not a whole lot of content for social and exploration rules. However, there are rules for social encounters in Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And Z Bashew did a great video about 5 years ago on these rules and how to use them. I'll put the link below. I don't understand why these rules weren't put in the 2014 Player's Handbook to begin with, but there's no excuse to not put them in the 2024 Player's Handbook when it comes out. In fact, maybe expand on these a little more and give some really good examples to help people understand how to use these roles. Then we would truly have a social pillar of play that's supported by actual rules. Number 6. So while we're talking about pillars of play, let's talk about the exploration pillar. There really is no excuse for 5th edition to not have good exploration rules. Previous editions had dungeon turns, and 4th edition had skill challenges. There's no reason you can't come up with some sort of combination of those 2 rule sets for a new, fresh take on the exploration pillar of play. Number 5. Another thing I would like to see are better random encounter tables. And a good random encounter table is not simply a list of monsters with a bunch of numbers next to them. Random tables should give you more than just encounters. They should inspire you with NPCs and plot hooks and adventures. And of the official D&D books, Van Richten's Guide is a good example of this. Not only does the book explain the domains of dread, each domain has a set of random encounters that does a fair bit of heavy lifting when it comes to generating ideas of how to use that domain in an actual adventure at your table. These are the kind of random tables that I want to see in the new DM's guide. Obviously, the encounter tables couldn't be as specific as the ones in Van Richten's guide, but you could have a number of different generic ones based on wilderness encounters, urban encounters, and dungeon encounters. Take a look at Shadowdark RPG and see how great their random encounter tables are. Number 4. While we're talking about Shadowdark, let me say that their NPC random tables are excellent as well. And that's the next thing I want to talk about is more tools for building NPCs. Make it easier for DMs to create colorful NPCs that their players can engage with. Like I said when we were talking about alignment, there is an NPC section in the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. In fact, it's in Chapter 4, and it's pretty good. But it definitely could be better when you compare it to the NPC generator tables in Shadowdark or the player character creation tables in games like Knave and Knave 2nd Edition. I think it would be very valuable for Wizards of the Coast to revisit Chapter 4 of the 2014 DMG and expand on it and create a more robust version for the 2024 DMG. Number 3. Next on the list is faction building, and that shouldn't surprise you since I just released a video on faction building as a core concept of my campaign prep method. But honestly, one of my favorite books from 5th edition is the Ravnica campaign setting. Not because I'm a big Magic the Gathering fan, and not because I've even run any adventures in Ravnica. What I find most useful about that book is how they build the world of Ravnica around the 10 guilds. And they use those factions, those 10 guild factions, to elaborate on the world itself and to show you as a DM how you can use factions to create conflict, and those conflicts can drive a narrative for an adventure. If you've never looked at the Ravnica campaign setting, it's impressively well done, and much better than the recent campaign setting they did for Spelljammer. First thing they do with the Ravnica campaign setting is they give you backgrounds for each of the guilds. This incentivizes the players to understand what the 10 guilds are, because by choosing a guild, they get unique background features that their players can actually use. Then in the DM section, they give you random charts that you can roll that generate conflicts with the other guilds. So when you're building an adventure, you can pick any 2 of the 10 guilds, roll on the random tables, and generate some interesting conflicts to build an adventure around. Then you can look at the guilds your player characters chose for their backgrounds and see how those guilds have conflicts with the 2 guilds you chose to center your adventure around. Now you have a whole handful of plot hooks to help you drive a narrative and create a campaign. It's really excellent design work, and I wish Wizards of the Coast had done more of it with other campaign settings. And they could absolutely do that with the 2024 edition because it's still going to be set in the Forgotten Realms. You already have the 5 factions from the Adventurers League: the Emerald Enclave, the Harpers, the Lord's Alliance, the Order of the Gauntlet, and the Zentarum, which could include examples like Xanathar's Guild, the Flaming Fists as seen in the new Baldur's Gate 3 game, and the Red Wizards of Thay as seen in the new D&D movie. Those 8 alone are enough to create some really compelling adventures. But even if you aren't running games in the Forgotten Realms, if you take a look at this design structure, you could create something really similar or just reskin what they already have and adapt it to whatever campaign setting you are running. Number 2, next on the list is dungeon design, because what's the name of this game? Dungeons and Dragons. And there are dungeon building tools in the 2014 DMG. And they're good. You can use them to generate a random dungeon. They're definitely usable, but I think they could be better. I'll give you an example from another 5th edition book that I think Wizards of the Coast did a really good job on, and that's Eberron Rising from the Last War. So for example, arcane workshops exist in Eberron. So they give you a map of what a typical arcane workshop looks like, and then they give you adventure hooks that would be attached to an arcane workshop. Likewise, they give you a map of a planar observatory and adventures and NPCs to go along with planar observatories. Then they give you a map of a druid gate and a list of druid NPCs and adventures to go along with that druid gate. Now those examples are more specific to Eberron, but you could certainly do the same kind of thing in a more generic fashion with things like a dragon's lair, an orc fortress, a drow matriarch's mansion. And some of you might be thinking they already did that in Volo's Guide to Monsters, and you're right. They gave us a goblinoid camp. They gave us examples of hag covens and their huts. They also gave us a mind flare lair. So those are all really useful. The problem is Volo's Guide is out of print, and they don't sell it on D&D Beyond anymore in the digital format. So the only people who have it are those of us who still have the hardback. So making more of those sample dungeons would be a great thing to put in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. And number 1, last and most importantly, is better monster design. The name of the game is Dungeons and Dragons. We need better monsters for the DMs to be able to run this game, especially as we've seen the power curve of players get greater and greater. The Dungeon Master absolutely needs better tools to make the game more challenging and more exciting. And the best place to start with that is your monsters. And as I record this, Matt Colville's book, Flee Mortals, has just wrapped up their Kickstarter, and you can get their PDF. And his action-oriented monster design is really well done, and I like it. And there's no reason why the new version of D&D can't do something similar. It doesn't have to be as elaborate as Matt Colville's design. We already have 2 things in the game that most monsters don't have, but every player does. That's reactions and bonus actions. The fact that you have 4 to 6 players sitting around your table, and during one round of combat, they all get to take an action, plus most of them will be able to take a bonus action, and a few of them will be able to take reactions in that same turn. Significantly outnumbers the amount of actions your monsters can take unless you put a boatload of monsters into your encounters. And then as a DM, you're now running several monsters and that slows down combat. A simple solution that I've been using for years that isn't as advanced as Matt Colville's action-oriented design, but still works just as effectively, is giving my monsters bonus actions and reactions. This is a really simple fix that improves the action economy of your monsters, and I really hope to see more of that design in the 2024 Monster Manual. But honestly, I would be very surprised if any of the 10 things on this wish list make it into the 2024 version of D&D. Pleasantly surprised, but surprised. But what do you think? What do you want the 2024 version of D&D to look like? Tell me in the comments, because I have really enjoyed interacting with you guys and participating in those conversations we've been having in the comments below. So thanks again for watching, and thanks again for being a part of the Dire Den.